Hi, it's Dennis Daly. I've always had a fascination with time. My apartment is full of clocks. That's why twice a year, when the time changes, I have to take a deep breath and get a short ladder. When I was with United Press International, I came up with the idea of a radio show called The Extra Hour. It aired in the middle of the night when we got that extra hour. Here's a portion of one of those shows.
For 2 decades, the man in charge of time in Canada was Dr. C.C. Costain. He retired 2 years ago this week. Dr. Costain joins us from his home in Canada by telephone. Doctor, you have had a long and illustrious career in working with that tick, tick, tick of time. Over the years, how has the way that countries stayed in sync with each other improved?
Well, we've always, from the earlier shortwave days, of course, each country listened to its signals from the other broadcasts and maintained a sort of loose coordination that way. But then, for several decades now, all of the quite a number of countries in Europe and certainly Canada and the States have been reporting the reception time, say, it was of the Lorentz signal, which was a precisely timed navigation system. And that was reasonably accurate, 1 or 2 microseconds. And we report these measurements to the Bureau in Paris, the Bureau International de l'Heure. And they put all of their measurements from all laboratories at about 100 labs reporting. They put them into their computer, average them out, and that average is then international time, or the UTC.
Doctor, one thing, can you cite any instances of 2 countries independently keeping time at their own locations that suddenly came to the realization that even though they were doing it independently, they hadn't actually stayed in sync over a period of time?
Yes, well, of course, in the States, the National Bureau of Standards and also the U.S. Naval Observatory keep their own time scales. We do in Canada at the National Research Council. And when we checked with the time that we keep with our primary cesium standard, with that in Germany, that we agreed within plus or minus a millionth of a second for about 7 or 8 years. And these are entirely independent operations. I don't think either of us knew we were that good.
A conversation with Dr. C.C. Costain, the retired director of the National Research Council of Canada's Time Division, who for more than 2 decades was in charge of maintaining time in Canada and a pioneer in coordinating time among the nations of the world. Dr. Costain says his favorite phrase is,
"You're very welcome. We have lots of time."
And so keeping the world's time signals together is a little bit more difficult than walking from your bathroom into your kitchen to make sure your clocks jive.
A look at travel timetables and dealing with people in 24 different time zones when the Extra Hour continues on the UPI Radio Network.
Check your clock. It's now a little after 31 minutes after 1 o'clock Standard Time.
It was only when man started going down to the sea in ships in search of new worlds that time became infinitely more important. The ancient astronomers knew well the signs in the sky, the stars, and their relationship to the horizon. That could tell them how far north or south they were, but they had no idea how far east or west they were going. And to discover new worlds, they needed to sail west. When Christopher Columbus set sail, he had little idea of how much westward progress he was making. Then came the pendulum clock, with unheard-of accuracy for its day. But since ships heave and pitch in the water, no pendulum would swing reliably. The push to develop a clock that would work at sea in the roughest conditions brought about the development of the first reasonably reliable spring-wound clocks in the 1700s. Had it not been for navigators, the development of clocks might have been spurred on only by monks, anxious to know when to ring the chapel bell on time. Every year, the airlines and the bus systems and the train systems have to change their timetables several times, not only to accommodate new routings, but also to accommodate the time change. Cliff Black is the Director of Communications for Amtrak. I asked him whether or not Amtrak has a problem twice a year when time changes to daylight and back again to standard, as it is doing on this overnight.
We do have one such train that operates between New York and Chicago, and
it's my understanding that a portion of eastern Indiana still does not recognize daylight time, and they stay on standard time. So there's a little flip-flop there, but it's well notated in the timetable. The fun begins in the fall timetable changeover, or the fall time changeover, when daylight time becomes standard time. And what happens is all our trains that are operating at 1 a.m., or I believe it's 2 a.m. now.
2 a.m.
2 a.m.
2 becomes 1.
Right. On Sunday, those trains that are actually en route at timetable changeover time, or rather daylight saving time changing to
This is not an unconfusing problem, or we wouldn't be here talking about this.
But what happens is, if those trains that are passing through that time changeover period were to continue operating at their normal speed, they would arrive at downline stations an hour ahead of time. And people who had been fastidious and had made sure they set their clocks back would find themselves missing the train. So what we do is we simply hold the train at the station closest, scheduled station stop closest to 2 a.m. and allow an hour to pass. In the spring, we simply operate late, and we try to make up as much time as we can, but there's no way we're going to depart in the springtime on schedule and then go to our end point and find ourselves being on schedule without speeding. So in the spring, we simply arrive approximately an hour late at the end point.
Of course, I think if you had to make a choice, a friend of mine is with the bus system here in Washington, and she says that it's one thing for a bus to be late. They don't like their drivers to be late, but boy, if they leave early,
sure,
that's a problem, because people depend on that. I mean, you always grumble when a train or a bus or an airplane is late, but if it leaves without you, that's a different story altogether.
Of course. Exactly. It is a sometimes amusing, sometimes frustrating situation in the fall when we change over to standard time, and the Night Owl, for example, which is a train that operates every night between Washington and Boston, simply makes a station stop. The northbound one usually is in Trenton, New Jersey area, and the southbound is in the Stamford, Connecticut area. They simply make an hour-long station stop instead of a 2 or 3 minute station stop. And depending on how garrulous the conductor is, the passengers should be informed as to why they're making that long stop. And some people just can't believe that it's happening. They think it's silliness. But when you explain to them that as the train proceeds down the line and makes stops at New York and New Haven and Philadelphia and what have you, that the train would be operating an hour early all of a sudden, and the people who had hoped to catch the train would find that it had left long before they got there.
Cliff Black of Amtrak deals with trains in 4 time zones, but Bob Castle, the director of Armed Forces Radio in Los Angeles, deals with radio stations around the world in 24 time zones. How does he do it?
First of all, when we maintain contact with all of our stations around the world, we use Universal Coordinated Time, which most people remember as the old GMT, Greenwich Mean Time. It's now called Universal Coordinated Time, and we use that to communicate with all of our stations so that when we send them programming information, they're all working on the same basis.
Do I take it then that in many of those studios there would not only be a clock for local time but also one for universal time?
Right. And we send, actually, Armed Forces Radio Service here in Los Angeles acts as a conduit to send the programming out to our stations around the world. They do their own individual scheduling of those programs. The only programs that we really have a problem with real time is our live play-by-play sports events, which we do at least one a day, and on the weekends usually 2, sometimes 3 sports events. And those are taken live by the stations overseas generally.
Bob, one final thing, and that is, I'm sure that your network, Armed Forces Radio and TV, certainly has not only provided a lot of training for a lot of announcers who are on the air either as disc jockeys or news people now, but that old thing about being a taste of home away from home, I know is very, very important, whether it's in a military ongoing situation like Vietnam or someone just stationed in Frankfurt, Germany, rather lonely. What does it feel like to know that you're able to pipe into not only us here at UPI, but all the major networks, the 500-mile race, the Daytona 500, the Super Bowl, whatever it is, and instantly provide that piece of home for people overseas? I would think it would be a rather rewarding experience.
It is a rewarding experience, and especially when we hear from people overseas who are most appreciative of the fact that they are not able to get any American radio or television overseas, and the sporting events are particularly popular, and it's very gratifying, and we get a lot of good feedback from people overseas.
As I mentioned, Armed Forces Radio has been not only a training ground for a lot of us in broadcasting, but has brought a piece of home to thousands of servicemen and women around the world. I can remember about 10 or 15 years ago doing a tape every week on what had happened in my home state and sending it off to Armed Forces Radio. They then put it on their network, as they did many other tapes prepared by radio stations around the world, providing, as I said, a little piece of home to our men and women overseas, where it is not the same time as it is here.
A radio station with a very special time signal and a conversation with a radio announcer whose clock is always wrong when the extra hour continues on the UPI Radio Network.
Check your clock. It's now nearly 20 minutes till 2 Standard Time.
Since there are 24 hours in a day, it only makes sense that there should be 24 time zones. But before the standardization of time in the 1800s, there was a question as to where the first time zone should start, where the prime meridian should be. Many world capitals vied for that honor. Some thought the prime meridian should run through Paris or Washington or Rome. Finally, Greenwich, England, a suburb of London, won out, mostly because of the pioneering work in timekeeping by the engineers at the observatory there. Today, many people still set their clocks to Greenwich time, commonly referred to as Greenwich Mean Time. Today, it's called Coordinated Universal Time, since it is no longer a mean or average time, but a never-changing clock with unerring accuracy. So many people still set their clocks to Greenwich time, it has become worldwide standard. That's why people in Bangkok and Boston can hold telephone conferences for their business meetings and both know what time it is. Hopefully you're getting a little bit better understanding of how vital it is for the countries of the world to be in sync with each other, to have all of their clocks on exactly the same second. You may not be aware of the fact that all radio and TV stations in the United States have a strong interest in time so that they are all together. Here's a case in point. The station to which you are listening is a subscriber to the UPI Radio Network. We do our programming live, much of it coming from Washington, D.C., but sometimes from other cities around the U.S. and around the world. How does your local radio station know precisely when we are going to start? Well, we start our programs at specific times. For example, hourly newscasts start, of course, on the hour. But what if your clock at the radio station in your hometown is off a little bit? The announcer might give the call letters to the station and join UPI Radio, and we wouldn't be there. Or they might join us for the hourly newscast, and it might be 5 or 6 seconds in progress at that point. What we do is called a talk-up. We talk to the radio station before going on the air. Hopefully, what we say does not go out on the air. There are ways that your radio station can listen to the network without putting it out for broadcast. What I'm going to play you is a recording of a newscast done last week. You'll hear me talk to the stations privately, then you'll hear a tone go out. Every hour, the tone starts at exactly 15 seconds before the hour. It is the same tone at the same time every hour. So here's a rebroadcast of a little bit of that closed circuit, that private conversation, which you probably have never heard before. Faces, this is UPI Radio Network Washington. Dennis Daly standing by to bring you this hourly newscast. It begins 15 seconds from the automatic tone. Now, as soon as that tone got over, the stations have 10 seconds in order to join us. You'll hear another tone at the top of the hour, and then you'll hear the newscast start. If the station was alert and listened, it should have no problem joining us for the broadcast. UPI Radio News. I'm Dennis Daly. Doctors in Midland, Texas say it may be necessary. And with that, another hourly newscast is off and running. If you remember, right before the newscast, you heard a tone like this. UPI Radio sends that tone out every hour on the hour. Other radio and TV networks use other kinds of signals to tell you when it is precisely the top of the hour. Some use tweets or beeps or whistles, and one uses a bong. KSL Radio in Salt Lake City does something really special. It gets its newscast from a network that has a bong at the top of the hour. But on top of that bong is another chime, the ringing of the Nauvoo bell in the Mormon Tabernacle in Salt Lake City, a bell that has to be precisely on time so the two chimes hit at the same moment. Let's listen to KSL Radio, recorded earlier, joining a network newscast. You'll hear it identify itself, then you'll hear the network bong, and at the same instant, you'll hear the bell in the Mormon Tabernacle.
1160 KSL, Salt Lake City, the news authority.
The man who makes sure that KSL and the Mormon Tabernacle are exactly in sync with each other is John Donnell, Chief Engineer of KSL Radio. I asked him how he does it.
The system itself operates on a WWV receiver, which is in the basement of the tabernacle, which also controls the clock system at the tabernacle and also here at KSL and Triad Center.
John, earlier when we talked to WWV, they mentioned that there was that specific time signal that sends out encoding, and it's nice to see that there is a specific use of that computer signal.
The accuracy of the thing is easily within a fifth of a second. We have noticed that the clapper time varies a little bit winter to summer. It's a little bit slower in the winter, but it's just because of the mechanical relay that has to move the clapper to ring the bell. However, it's far more accurate than any satellite delayed time signal would be these days. And in fact, people set their clocks to it all over the western region, and we have people calling in asking about the accuracy of that all the time.
Does that signal automatically go into your radio transmitter? For example, if you're in the middle of a Brigham Young University football game, are we going to hear the bell over the top of it?
Yes, you will. We can cut it if we want to, but generally we don't. And it will ring any time, no matter what the programming is. It will signal on the hour so that you can check your watch or clock or whatever.
John Donnell of KSL Radio in Salt Lake City. When the Nauvoo bell is signaling the hour in Salt Lake City at radio station VOCM in St. John's, Newfoundland, it's the half hour. For Newfoundland is 30 minutes off with the rest of North America. David Kennedy works at VOCM. I asked him if that creates a problem.
The hardest thing we had to get used to were the jokes from the other parts of Canada when sometimes people say, the world is going to end at 9:30 in Newfoundland.
I guess you can retort by saying, though, that you're a half an hour ahead of everybody else.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Tell me a little bit, if you would, for those of us down here in the United States who know that Newfoundland is just about where it is and have heard of Gander, a little bit about Newfoundland and kind of capsulize what the country does except occupy space. I don't mean that derogatorily, but I need to educate myself.
Well, Dennis, a lot of people think that Newfoundland is made up of Eskimos or Inuit people, as they are now called, and ice and sea. And, of course, we do have a lot of ice and sea and Inuit people up in the Labrador portion of our province. But we also have, an extremely modern university in St. John's, and out in Corner Brook, we have a regional college, and we have ultra-modern paper mills in Grand Falls and Corner Brook, and we've got a school of medicine, a school of music, we've got a fine arts school, so we're coming along. And also, Gander is one of the points in North America where we got an awful lot of international defections. We get Cubans, Sri Lankans, Iranians, people from all over the world seek political asylum in North America through Gander.
Well, David, maybe I guess the bottom line is that, and I don't mean to sound like your Chamber of Commerce, but maybe people need to start recognizing Newfoundland for something else other than the fact that your clocks look funny.
Yeah, Newfoundland is a nice place to visit. Dennis, tell all your listeners to come up here next summer for their holidays.
We'll take a look at timekeeping on the racetrack and find out whether or not animals can tell time when the extra hour continues on the UPI Radio Network.
Check your clock. It's now about 12 minutes till 2 Standard Time.
When the globe finally got divided into 24 time zones, not every country wanted to participate in the master plan that required every time zone to be 1 hour off from its neighbor. For example, parts of the Indian subcontinent are 1/2 hour off with the rest of the world, so India is 5.5 hours off with London. To make matters worse, parts of northern India are 5 2/3 of an hour behind London, which is used as the 0 point. There is also confusion in Australia. The Australian continent is divided into 3 time zones, but unlike the U.S., where each is 1 hour off with the next, New York an hour ahead of Chicago, Denver an hour behind Chicago, the middle time zone in Australia is 30 minutes behind its neighbor to the east and 90 minutes ahead of the time zone to the west. And in our hemisphere, Newfoundland is a half hour off. The moral might be, if you're going to make an international phone call, check with the operator first to see what time it is over there before you call. Coordinating the world's time is one thing, but in the tiny world of the racetrack, split-second timing is also important. Art Graham is the director of timing for USAC, the United States Auto Club. I reached him at his office in Cincinnati and asked him just how fine they split the hairs now in championship auto racing.
Well, the precision that we have to deal with goes beyond hundredths of a second down to thousandths of a second at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. The speeds the cars are traveling nowadays, they will cover something on the order of 12 to 15 feet in a thousandth of a second. So as a consequence, that kind of precision becomes important. And we have been challenged to, as they go faster, we have to go faster, is about what it amounts to.
Can we go back in time decades, if not from your memory, at least from what you have been told there, when the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, for example, the record speed was 75 miles an hour. I'm sure stopwatches sufficed. There maybe were not, I'm sure, not electric eyes at the time. How was timekeeping accomplished in the days of mechanical timekeeping at racetracks, and did it take a lot of people standing there with their eye across the finish line to keep track of people on stopwatches?
Well, during the race, the latter was certainly true. During qualifying at any of the racetracks back in the early part of the century, with the mechanical kind of timers that you describe, the sensing mechanism on the racetrack was also mechanical. Literally, it was a tripwire that the car ran over and stretched it and pulled a lever and threw a switch and registered a time on the timer. So it's hard to imagine. It's hard for me to imagine nowadays that kind of an approach. But over time, we've introduced the electric photocells, and nowadays we use infrared self-focusing beams. Again, in each area of equipment and precision and so forth, as speeds have gone up and as the money that's at stake goes up, the timing process has to keep up with it.
Art, of course, with racing, we're talking not so much about keeping in synchronization with the rest of the world, and that's been our topic during much of this program, and that is the way the world keeps time, but time in your own little world, the world of the racetrack. You say that you're using infrared and that kind of thing. How do you keep track, for example, of cars that are not on the same lap with the leader? It's always intrigued me that you might have Mario Andretti might be leading a race and Gordon Johncock or someone is down 2 or 3 laps, but running neck and neck visually. Do you have a separate timer for each car? How is that accomplished?
Yeah, each car is identified separately. Nowadays, a full-scale system would involve not only the more classic method of assigning an individual human score to record the progress of each car on each lap with reference to the time, so that time becomes a means for putting the cars in order. But nowadays, we also equip the cars with radio transmitters or information to equipment at the starting line that can capture it. And at this point, just because of the complexity of the problem you described, we've become more and more reliant on computer equipment attached to that to go through the more fundamental processes of sorting out the information we have and presenting it to us as close to real time as we can manage.
Art Graham, the chief timer for USAC, talks about doing things in real time. What is real time? Well, maybe it's time established by nature. Do cows have clocks? Do they know what time it is? I put that question to Don Nielsen, a livestock owner and longtime animal expert with the United States Department of Agriculture in Fort Worth. According to Don, the animals don't care whether we set the clocks 1 hour backward, forward, or turn them off altogether.
They're going to eat by what the natural clock says, and if they have to have extra hours of feed, then they're going to get up earlier, or, the feed is short, or feed later. They have to work harder to get enough feed.
Don, do city folks perpetuate that rumor that whenever there's a total eclipse of the sun, the chickens go to roost, or do animals really think it's nighttime when something like that happens?
Well, I have been around during some partial eclipses, and none of those have been dark enough to see anything different in any change in the behavior of the animals.
So it would have to get pretty darn dark.
It would have to get very dark.
What about the drying aspects of crops, the natural effect that sunlight has on removing dew from the fields and removing fog from areas so work can be done? I presume that still stays on the sun cycle.
Oh, yes, it still is. For example, if you're going to be raking hay or baling hay or even mowing, you're going to have to wait until that dew's off. And your fruit people in harvesting and that kind of thing, it's got to be done by natural time or by the time when the dew's off, because you pick it with the dew on and put it in a box to ship it off to market. Everywhere it's been touched, you're going to have a damage mark on that fruit when it gets to market.
Is it safe to say that it is worse when we go to daylight in springtime or worse when we revert to standard in fall, or is it just a double inconvenience?
It's probably a double inconvenience, although in the springtime, one of the factors you will see with animals as traffic goes on the road earlier in the morning when animals don't expect it, you'll see more wildlife killed by cars.
It is easy to think, for example, and we've seen football games where if you live in the East Coast, it is dark, yet a football game taking place in California, the sun is still up. That's a simple assumption. They are 3 hours behind the East.
Right.
There are certain parts of Texas which are very far west in the central time zone. Yeah. Therefore, the sun may still be up when in other parts of the central time zone where it is the same time, it is already dark.
Yeah, oh yes.
Can you cite any extremes in Texas where that is the case because of the breadth of that state?
Well, let's go the other way. And let's look at in the summertime when the South Texas, being so much closer to the tropics doesn't have the long daytime that North Texas does. It gets dark a lot earlier in the summertime in South Texas than it does even here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and particularly up in the Panhandle.
Well, Don Nielsen, thank you for giving us a little bit of insight on the way that farmers and ranchers have to deal with animals who have their own set of standards and mostly go by the sun. Thank you for taking the time to join us.
Oh, you're welcome.
Dennis Daly returns with some closing thoughts about time when the extra hour continues on the UPI Radio Network.
Check your clock. It's coming up on 3 minutes until 2 Standard Time.
Our perception of time has changed over the years. Ancient man was concerned with the availability of food, the migration of animals, the length of the growing season. He wondered if there was sufficient time to hunt and eat before nightfall. Modern man wonders if there's time to run to the parking meter while they're inside hunting down the family dinner in a supermarket. Today we demand to know the time. We place thousands of calls to hundreds of automatic time machines seeking to find out the time in the most exact terms. The people who write commercials for radio sweat over how long they are to make sure they don't run overtime. Network newscasters take great pains in putting together newscasts to make sure their scripts are exactly on time, to the second. But for all of this, The clock keeps ticking. The frustration with time is that it passes whether we want it to or not. Psychologists say the only way we can control time is to learn to use it wisely. There is one great irony about time anymore, and that is its unerring accuracy. Timekeepers have become so sophisticated with their equipment that they keep an unvarying account of time. But the Earth speeds up and slows down. So now it is the Earth that gets off every so often, not our clocks which get off. Albert Einstein told us that time is a relative thing, and that is an easy thing to conceptualize. For a child waiting for Christmas to arrive so he or she can open their presents, the days drag by very slowly. But for a senior citizen sitting on a porch swing, looking back over a long and productive life, it's difficult to figure out where the time went so quickly. I'm Dennis Daly, thanking you very much for joining us this morning for this, our Extra Hour.
This special program was produced by Dennis Daly. Larry Webb speaking. This is the UPI Radio Network.
Thanks for listening. By the way, what time is it? I'm Dennis Daly.